Kia ora koutou. Good afternoon from Auckland. I'm Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar exploring the key public policy challenges New Zealand faces in the years ahead. We're delighted to be able to host our newly minted Honorary Senior Fellows to reflect on this topic. I think today's discussion is a great example of what this foundation was established to do, which is to drive debate on how New Zealand should navigate the years ahead and the kinds of public policy decisions we'll need to make to ensure New Zealanders continue to have a prosperous, sustainable, and inclusive country to call home. And being able to draw on some of the brightest and most interesting thinkers and practitioners in the country is a really powerful way to do that. So we're thrilled to be able to host Lucy, Stephen, and Jonathan in their inaugural webinar as Honorary Senior Fellows of our foundation. Before we jump into today's webinar, to note we've got an exciting range of webinars planned in the coming weeks and months, including with some globally recognized commentators. So keep an eye on your inbox for updates. Some of our coming webinars will be for members of our foundation only. So if you'd like to hear conversations like today's and to support our foundation's mission to develop long-term solutions to New Zealand's pressing policy challenges, we'd love to have you as a member. Membership fees are currently only $65 wage, $35 if you're a student or retired or unwaged. And so now would be a great time to join, which you can do via our website or the link that my colleague Oliver has placed in the chat section of today's webinar. So to today's webinar. First up, our customary reminder that, as I say, this is a webinar, not a Zoom call. So your cameras and microphones are deactivated and you're safe to eat your lunch and drink your coffee without being seen or heard. But we do hope you'll participate in the webinar by submitting questions into Zoom's Q&A function, which you access at the bottom of your screen. You can do that whenever a question occurs to you throughout the webinar, but please put it in the Q&A function, not the chat function. And finally, please let us know what you thought of this webinar by filling out the feedback form that should appear in your browser or your inbox at the conclusion of the webinar. So to today's panelists, Professor Jonathan Boston, ONZM, is an emeritus professor of public policy in the School of Government at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. His research interests include climate change, policy, child poverty, and governance. Jonathan will be writing for our foundation about public policy governance and the future of democracy. Lucy Cassels is an experienced global health policy specialist, researcher, and former career diplomat. She held a diverse range of roles at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And in her research and consultancy work, Lucy is particularly interested in the intersection of environmental and health challenges. She'll be writing for our foundation on climate resilient development and innovation, as well as broader global health issues. And finally, Stephen Jacobi currently serves as the director of the Australia-New Zealand Leadership Forum, which brings together business and government to create greater prosperity, security, and sustainability for both countries. As a former diplomat and official, Stephen has served in various capacities, including stints leading both the New Zealand-US and New Zealand-China councils, as well as the APEC Business Advisory Council. And he is a frequent media and public commentator on industry, trade, and international issues. And Stephen will be writing for the foundation on international trade issues and foreign affairs. So thanks to everyone who's joined to watch this webinar today. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. And Helen, over to you to moderate today's conversation.
Well, thank you, Murray, and greetings, everyone, and particular welcome to the three incredible people who are coming on to our foundation's platform as Honorary Senior Fellows. Known all of them for quite some time. Jonathan and his roles at Victoria University in public policy, Lucy with the phenomenal work she did negotiating for New Zealand around the COVID-19 issues, pandemic issues, etc. And then Stephen has been Mr. Trade really for a long time and has so much expertise. So we're going to sort of run through a series of ideas and thoughts from each of the Honorary Senior Fellows, starting with Jonathan. The big question, and I'll come to next the other two. What, in your professional opinion, is the biggest long-term policy problem facing New Zealand today?
Well, thank you, Helen, and it's a great pleasure to be an honorary fellow of the foundation. As I'm sure everyone in this panel and online will be aware, globally we face an enormous range of challenges. People talk about a pandemic or a perma-crisis, We face obviously geopolitical issues, ecological issues, technological challenges, all manner of socioeconomic issues and so forth. But it seems to me one of the most critical ones, and this applies for all nations, democratic or otherwise, is how to protect long-term interests, the interests of future generations, in a context where there are very powerful political pressures to focus on the short term. And those political pressures obviously differ from country to country, but in a democracy like New Zealand, politicians are under very significant pressure to deliver short-term goals and gains for citizens in a context where frequently there are significant intertemporal trade-offs, so that by focusing on short-term goals, you may be undermining long-term prosperity or the environment or some other long-term goal. And it seems to me this is an enduring big issue. And that issue has become all the greater in a context where humanity has such a greater capacity to damage long-term interests now than was the case, for example, 50 years, 100 years ago. And that increased capacity to damage future interests obviously is partly related to extraordinary technological innovations over recent generations. So if that's the issue, the question then is, well, how do we address democratic myopia or short-termism? And very briefly, there is no single, simple silver bullet answer in my view, but there are multiple things that we can do to try and enhance our capacity to protect long-term interests. We can endeavor, for example, to embed the future in the present in our decision-making, both in the political arena, but also in business. We can do that, for example, among other things, by the kind of discount rate we use. If we use a very high discount rate, obviously we're going to be discounting the future very rapidly. If we use a lower discount rate, then we will be giving more weight to the future. Secondly, we can seek to emphasize and exercise better foresight. And that means investing in a range of foresight techniques, such as scenario analysis and risk assessments and so forth. Thirdly, we can put in place all manner of commitment devices. And we do that, of course, in the form of things like climate targets or child poverty reduction targets. Commitment devices are essentially designed to try and strengthen the political incentives for people to deliver for the longer term. And then there's other things we can do. We can amend our institutions, our political institutions, public service and so on in ways that are going to potentially at least enhance the emphasis we give to long-term considerations. So that's just a very, very quick answer, Helen, to a very big problem, one that I know you've wrestled with over your lifetime. And I'll leave it there and come back to any matters you want to raise subsequently.
Thanks, Jonathan. As you said, there's so much pressure to focus on the short term. But if we only do that, we won't do much at all, because we'll be like a dog chasing its tail around the latest headline. The elders, which I'm a member of, put out a call in the last year or two for what we termed long view leadership. Leaders have to take that long view. Now, of course, you do things in the short term, but many steps in the right direction taken now lead to long-term solutions if you get them right. So keeping that long-term goal in mind is so important. You also spoke in a way which reminded me of that classic definition of sustainable development, which was about how we meet the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And of course, we've tended generation by generation to squander what we've got, and we leave less and less, particularly for the planet, if we go that way. So lots of big issues there. Now, of course, the economic future for New Zealand is tricky. We've got the huge agri base. We're off and on with innovation and how we encourage it and how we nurture the kinds of companies which could really deliver the high skill, high wage, high productivity economy, which would support the services and lifestyle that we want. Stephen, I'd like you to talk a little bit about this. How do we break out of this straitjacket we're in to an economy that can deliver better for all of us?
Well, kia ora tātou e te whānau, tēnei te mihi nui kia koutou. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and indeed an honour to serve alongside Lucy and Jonathan on the Helen Clark Foundation. And thank you, Helen, for your foresight in establishing this with Peter, and to all the team, thanks for the arrangements that have been made for us. And Helen, I mean, you've put your, as you often do, you've hit the nail right on the head. I mean, there's no one answer to the problem that you pose, of course, but I would say that the biggest challenge facing New Zealand is how we can build a competitive, sustainable and inclusive economy that can sustain the sort of lifestyles and expectations that New Zealanders aspire to. And as you know, most of my career has been involved in the trade space versus an official and latterly from the perspective of business. And we've had a successive wave of trade negotiations over the last 30 years, and we put in place new trade rules. And today, over 80% of our exports go to markets where we have FTAs, even if not all the FTAs, free trade agreements, are equal. And of course, today, actually literally today and tomorrow, we are seeing considerable strain on the international trading system and considerable uncertainty about the way forward. But here's the thing, New Zealand businesses today have more opportunities open to them than they can fully exploit. We've opened so many new doors, but only a few exporters really are able to go through them. New Zealand Trade and Enterprise identifies around 12,000 exporters in New Zealand, but only 340 companies that export more than $25 million. Apparently, about 700 earn between 5 million and 25 million. That is a very thin base for a developed economy. Exports in New Zealand make up less than 30% of our GDP. In other small advanced economies, we like to compare ourselves with, Ireland, Finland, Singapore. The figure's more like 60%. And the fundamental problem that we face, and that we faced, well, since forever, is this: Aotearoa is unique. We are a developed Western, for want of a better word, nation with a small population base located at some distance from our major markets, relying on a natural resource-based economy. We don't have a large domestic market of scale. We don't have large revenue generating sectors beyond the agri-food sector. I'll come to that. We don't have bigger enterprises that compete on the world stage. We don't have the capital that can empower innovation, job creation, and economic and social development. So how do we address this? That's the big question. And I'm not arguing that we turn our back on the international trading system. Not that you'd expect me to say that. That work we've been doing for the last 30 years has got to continue at the global level. Okay, there'll be fewer FTAs maybe, but we can make them work better. But what we've got to do is to look back home to ensure our economy can deliver for our people. We have to boost productivity and competitiveness, and we need some new ideas to sort that out. And Helen, it's 25 years ago or more that you launched the Knowledge Wave conference. And since then, we've seen the emergence of creative and digital sectors, but even so, our economy remains very dependent on agri-food sector. Once upon a time, we looked to economic reform to transform the economy. And later, we looked to trade liberalization, the opening of global markets. And then we had the fortuitous emergence of China that helped us along the way. But the world, and I think as Jonathan has said, the world is rapidly changing. Protectionism is on the rise. New technologies are casting a big shadow, but also opening opportunity across the world. And we've got this climate change problem that is threatening life itself. This is a multifaceted challenge. One policy instrument can't deliver all we need at this juncture, but we need the best minds to be working on this, in my view. if we want to see a preferred future for Aotearoa, and if we can work out how we can sustain it economically. And I'm looking forward to the ideas in the kōrero today. Kia ora.
Well, if I could 1000% agree with you, I would, because it really sounds very much like speeches I was making 25 years ago of what we needed to do. And, I was thinking, 80% of our exports going to countries that we have some kind of free trade agreement with. I was trying to think, who would the other 20% be? And I suppose you think of the milk powder that goes into North Africa. Even Venezuela used to be a big milk powder market. But the truth is, as you said, we don't have enough exports as a proportion of our GDP. And then, if we leverage from our strengths, I mean, agri-tech, it's not just the commodities. We have technology associated with that, which has long been world leading, but we need to always be upping our game in that. So, yes, so much to get stuck in there. And yes, we have those sort of chains around our ankle of being a long way from markets, and the domestic market's small and we're spread over a long way. But as Ernest Rutherford, who was the first Kiwi to win the Nobel Prize, once said, New Zealand hasn't got much money, so it has to think. Time to think.
Yeah.
So that's what this webinar and this whole program is around. Now, Lucy, I think that leads rather nicely into you, because you wanted to talk about, how we support innovation and sustainability, how we build the talented workforce, how we keep inclusion in mind in that. And one thing I should say to our audience is that you have been, not so long ago, a Deputy Secretary for Policy and Strategy in the Ministry for Pacific peoples in New Zealand. So, the inclusion of all the diverse peoples of our country would be very much top of your mind. So come on in now.
Thanks, Helen. Kia ora, everyone. And I just want to echo colleagues by saying huge kudos to the Foundation for launching this fellowship series. Jonathan and Stephen have been such huge thought leaders here in New Zealand, as have you, Helen, and I'm really proud. So thank you for having me along to this talk today and for the launch of the fellowship series. So critical long-term problems. I guess listening to you, and when I listen to Stephen and Jonathan's points, I do think about enablers. If we want our democracy to thrive, and if we want our economy to deliver well-being for Kiwis, there are some critical enablers in that mix. How do we build and retain the talented workforce we need to achieve those things? And if we want that paradigm shift away from primary production and more exports, how do we support more complex private sector development? And there's a bit of an R&D conundrum in there for New Zealand, because our rates of R&D investment are so low. As you say, Helen, how do we have an inclusive workforce strategy that ensures that all talent sources are being tapped, and that we're capturing young people from all backgrounds and all ethnicities in our tertiary institutions, and launching them off into the workforce in a really active and sustainable way? Because, we do face those problems at the moment in those areas. We're leaking talent, particularly to Australia, particularly of young people. I've seen this in my teams in the public service. I think more needs to be done to package New Zealand as a place to stay and contribute to. If offshore workers can see the value, in my local area, we have an enormous influx of Brits, for example. If they can see the value of coming here for a sustainable, healthy lifestyle for their families, why aren't we encouraging and persuading Kiwis to stay? And certainly, yes, we need to support innovation better and leverage lessons from other countries offshore. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that later on, if that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, is it just that distant fields look greener, or is there something more profound going on? And I fear the latter. I came from a generation where people definitely did their OE, but most of us came back. I couldn't wait to get back. I wanted to run for Parliament. I had more of my university career to follow. I never thought of making a life anywhere else but New Zealand. But I sense now a feeling that, this place is too small, too quiet, not enough jobs, I'm off. And unfortunately, when the young go, particularly if it's across the ditch, to Australia, often the parents follow as well. So you lose whole family clusters, and people have been the really the pillars of your community. So it's a huge worry. And I like your term, package New Zealand as a place to stay in. New Zealand does have a lot going for it, but not if we constantly bleed our people of all abilities and skills levels. So let's come back to thinking about that. Now, people often look for quick fixes, and one of them, in my mind, could be, do we have a long enough parliamentary term? Total declaration of interest here. When it went to referendum in 1990, I voted for the 3-year term. I spent a lot of years in opposition. I always found 3 years quite long, and 4 years would have been water torture. And as a PM, I found that if you knew what you were doing and got cracking, you could get a lot done in 3 years' term. And I think we did get a lot done. But it's come back round again. Should there be a 4-year term? I sometimes wonder if MMPs change things fundamentally, that we have perhaps fewer of the long-term parliamentarians like myself, who are the backbones of governments and come into government with experience and ready to run. Certainly, apparent in parts of the current government, but that's not unique to it. So, Jonathan, would you like to opine on this? Do you have a view?
Well, I do, Helen, and let's just put the context in here. From an international perspective, the current parliamentary term in New Zealand is relatively short. Most democratic countries have either a 4- or a 5-year term. Some of those are fixed terms, some of them are flexible terms, some of them are semi-fixed. So we are, relatively speaking, unusual in having only 3 years. That is the case in Australia and some of the states in Australia, but in most parts of certainly Europe, United States, and so on, it's for the president, it's 4 years, and in some countries 5 years. I have long supported the idea that having a slightly longer term, 4 years, would be preferable, on the basis that would provide an opportunity for better policy development and implementation, particularly in dealing with very big policy issues, like, for example, resource management reform. But I've never taken the view that a 4-year parliamentary term would make a huge difference to the way our democracy operates. And I'm very mindful that there are arguments against a 4-year term. As you say, Helen, if you're lumbered with a bad government, it's a long time to stay. There's also the risk, of course, of really bad things happening, and a lack of sort of checks on the executive. So my view would be, if we were to move to a 4-year term, I would want to do that in the context, first of all, of having either a semi-fixed or a fixed term, which would reduce the capacity of politicians to call early elections to suit their particular convenience. But secondly, in the context of a wider parliamentary reform. And exactly what that should be, I appreciate it's open to debate, but I've long taken the view that we have a parliament that's too small and which is dominated by the executive. So when the opportunity arose for that review of the electoral system 40 years ago, the Royal Commission recommended a House of 150. If we were to adjust for population, that would mean having a House of around 200 MPs now. And that would put us broadly in line with the situation in countries like Denmark, Finland, Ireland, which have comparable population sizes. The advantage of having a larger house means you'd have greater depth of capability and talent. It also would mean that we could have a more effective select committee process, which would hopefully provide greater capacity to hold governments to account, and also hopefully improve the quality of the kind of policy process. But the problem would be, I don't see much prospect of getting that kind of reform, Helen, and I somewhat despair, actually, at the prospect of significant constitutional change that could really enhance the quality of our democracy. And just to go to your point about people leaving the country and so on, I mean, I'm one of those many people of my generation where my family offspring are offshore. Two daughters and their husbands living in London. all kind of engaged in kinds of work that, at least in some cases, they would find difficult to do here because there's so few jobs. And so when it comes to thinking about the long term, if I could just mention one thing that I think, Lucy, you mentioned, or it might have been Stephen, it's the fact that we invest so little in research and development in this country. We're right down near the bottom of the OECD in terms of the proportion of gross domestic product that we spend on research and development. And all the evidence that I have seen over the years, many, many years, is that countries, other things being equal, countries that spend more on research and development are more likely to have higher rates of productivity and of course be able to both develop and retain really significant talent. So I know that's a diversion from 4-year terms, but I think we have to think very broadly about the kinds of challenges we face, as indeed Lucy and Stephen have mentioned, and you also, Helen, and we need an integrated, thoughtful, evidence-based approach to how we improve the quality of our democracy and how we improve the quality of the economy and society more generally.
Gosh, so many great points to pick up there. My recollection is, as yours, that the higher the proportion of the spend on R&D, the more likely the economy is to be, going ahead, delivering higher value production through innovation, etc. And my recollection from my time as PM was that at that time the public sector spend wasn't completely out of line with offshore, but the private sector spend was pathetic. And that's why we went down the track of R&D tax incentives. Treasury always preferred grants, and it seemed to me that you spent just about as much, sort of applying for and getting all your papers in order for the grant, trying to comply with the requirements as you eventually got out of it. So, but for some reason, we swing backwards and forwards on this. I'm strongly in favour of a tax incentive for R&D to boost the private sector spend on it. Now, of course, there have been massive cuts to government science in the last 20 months or so. So it may well be on the government side, the public side, that we're down as well. But we're not going to go anywhere as a high-value economy if we're not an innovator. If you are an innovation taker, not maker, you will lag behind, unfortunately. Just on the 4-year term, while we're on it, and there was also a question on it, there was a rather odd statement that came out of the Beehive in February, which said the government had agreed to introduce legislation that would enable a 4-year term of Parliament subject to a referendum. Now, what it said was a standard term of Parliament would remain at 3 years, but with the ability to extend it to 4. The main condition is that membership of certain select committees is calculated in a way that is proportionate to the non-executive parliamentary party membership of the House. Now, I must say I find this quite incomprehensible. Are we going into each election period not knowing whether it's 3 years or 4 because we don't know what the composition of select committees will be? Jonathan, can you enlighten us?
Oh, well, look, I thought that particular proposal was mind-bogglingly stupid. I just couldn't understand the political logic of proposing this unless you exactly wanted to avoid having a 4-year term. I mean, the idea also that an opposition party would negotiate to have a 4-year term by having a few more people on select committees after an election is mind-bogglingly extraordinary, isn't it, Helen? I mean, why would the opposition want to have to sit there for 4 years?
Because you've just gone into opposition. You don't want to be there 4 years.
Anyway, the good news is it's not going to happen. And I think that probably leads to another point. I think that even if a 4-year term was put to a referendum in the context of possible other changes that might enhance accountability, I don't think citizens would vote for it. And we've already.
I think that's really the key point there, isn't it? And just to say, I've never been a great fan of the idea of the 4-year the 4-year term. And it seems to me that if all the politicians think it's a good idea, then you want to be starting to think about, why is that exactly? But and I think you mentioned it earlier too, Jonathan. It's the check on the executive. And what we tried to do with the MMP was to was to make a government that was more accountable, to make governments more accountable. And indeed, in some respects, we've got greater diversity in Parliament, certainly, but we still see this problem of all-powerful governments can do anything they want. So I would be interested in an idea of a longer term, if it was in the again, not at MMP as a whole, but we should be looking at the power of parties that this has created, and the way that this has made our democracy less accountable, not more.
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I think where we're converging around here is there's quite a package of reforms that need to be done, and looking at 4-year term in isolation on the current conditions isn't necessarily an answer at all. Lucy, coming back to you, we touched on the brain drain earlier, and I assume there's also been quite an exodus from our public service. How can we look at rebuilding that and make sure that the best and brightest talent would want to go into a public service career? I can say again, as a long-time politician, you rely so much on a talented public servant. If you don't have that, you struggle as a government. You shouldn't be getting your public policy from the big firms, the McKinseys, the Deloittes, the whatever. They may have their place somewhere, but it seems to me that with a debilitated public service, we run the risk of running from consultancy to consultancy, contract to contract, and not having continuity of policy. Would you like to say anything about that based on your long experience in public service?
Thanks, Helen. I totally agree. We do need a strong public service, and you're right. It's a real bugbear of mine, the way as the political pendulum shifts, we go from a trend of hiring consultancies and losing the core employees in the public service, and then we swing back in the other direction. And my observation over the last 20 years or so has been often we go too far in either direction each time we do it. It's a real problem, and people are burned and lost every time we go into a slash and burn environment. I just want to say I've been really proud to be part of a lean and talented Kiwi public service. People often say to me, government's doing this and government's doing that. And I say to them, public servants are just everyday people, mums and dads, young people, older people who are working every day to get good policies, good programs and good services out for New Zealanders. And I don't think our public service is bloated. Stephen will remember, as a diplomat, we famously go offshore with tiny delegations. Our people do the job of maybe 10 people in an American or a European country's delegation. Often they don't even know their own people from different departments because their bureaucracies are so enormous. Kiwis, they work on the smell of an oily rag as public servants, and they do a very good job. So there's my shout out for the public service. Back to your actual point, Helen. It's under the pump right now. People are losing their jobs. They can't get their foot on the ladder if they're a young person wanting to go in. And it's ironic because we need good people more than ever. As you say, we need good policy people to produce papers for leaders to make decisions. We need the right people negotiating agreements offshore, as Stephen has done. For trade access, we need good doctors and nurses in hospitals. So I really do worry about the brain drain. There was a billboard the other day. The sign was, lower pay, why stay? And I mean, that's really persuasive. If you're a young person who can't buy a house, or you can't afford the rent, or your family can't afford its mortgage, that really is meaningful as an argument for moving offshore, moving to Oz, wherever else. So how do we get people to commit to the public service as a vocation? Well, first of all, we need the jobs. So hopefully the pendulum will shift somewhat back where we're in a hiring position, because the problem is if we scare everyone away now and we move back into a tight labour market, and I can recall hiring in a tight public service labour market, you simply don't have the talented people to choose from to do your jobs and get your jobs done and get your papers up to ministers. So we need better pathways for people to get into the public service. We need better outreach in universities. Down in the south, growing up in the south, I can say most of us have no contact with core public service. public service policy careers. We need people in universities and in schools promoting those careers. There are opportunities for young Kiwis. They don't need to go overseas. They can go to Wellington. If they're an environmental science graduate, there might be a job with Doc, you know, they just don't see those careers out in the region. So I'm quite passionate about that. We need more outreach to talent for internships. Public Service Commission's doing a great job with that at the right now, actually, advertising internships for government ministries. And once we get them, this is what I'm really passionate about, particularly about the way we treat people in the public service and in workplaces generally, give people opportunities to grow and enjoy their work. And, you know, in our global health diplomacy team and formally in MFAT in our teams, we would try and get talented young people out early on delegations offshore, give them an opportunity to get a passion for the work. They work really hard and they, by and large, did a very good job, but we can't always pay the most, but we can give opportunities. And I just want to finish on that point, Helen, that you remarked on earlier about packaging New Zealand as a place to stay. We as a country, we're just not a culture where we're going to salute a flag in the morning when we get to school or go to our workplace. We just, that's not the Kiwi way, I don't think, for whichever way you think of that. But we can be proud of being New Zealanders. Most public servants I talk to, and indeed me myself, a core driver of a job in the public service is delivering for New Zealanders outcomes. And I think we need to make more of that. And I think we need to sell that and make that something to be proud of. So I think that's all part of my prescription for how we keep and retain our best talent.
Yeah, I'd like to offer a reflection based on my time at UNDP about the critical importance of public service capacity, because sometimes you see things even more clearly when you're offshore. And UNDP had a very sizable governance portfolio in my time, and a lot of it was focused on how you built the capacity of professional public services, which many countries lack. And so if you lack that, you may announce visions and policies, but they never get implemented because there's not capacity. Now, what I was able to reflect on was that as a minister in the late 80s, 87 to 90, and then as PM leading a team of ministers, when we announced a policy, it was properly researched, we knew how it would be implemented, and we knew we had the capacity to do it. And I can't think of one that failed. Now, what I've noticed, and it goes back over the past decade or more now, is there's more announcing of policies which are not well based on evidence and don't have a practical implementation plan and actually don't deliver much at all, or may just fail. I think this will take us so far backwards if we don't build that capacity. You need to know as a decision maker that the policy's sound, that the implementation plan is sound, and if followed, you can expect to get the results that were forecast. If you don't have that, government service provision policy is a disaster. So that's my homily on that. I feel extremely strongly about it. I think I'm hearing some murmurs of approval from my panel, but it just is so important.
Can I just add to that, please, Helen? Sorry to interrupt. I also wanted to say part of that mix is a to and fro of respect and support between the leadership, the government, the executive, and the public service. And I fondly remember as a starting diplomat putting up papers to yourself and Phil Goff and knowing they would be read and closely read. And we had your scribble and we had Phil's scribble come back and always informed commentary. And I just think in New Zealand, we have quite a precious closeness between our public service and our leaders and executive, and that respect and that interplay of ideas is really, really precious and important. So thanks for being part of that and a good example of that in my career anyway.
And I worked with some incredible people in public service who I stay in touch with to this day to bounce ideas off. So that's just how important it is. Maybe I know we're coming up to a time where we should bring in our audience, but perhaps some more quick fire things. A lot of talk around now about artificial intelligence, almost to the extent you got a spectrum that goes from this is the greatest threat to humanity we've known to actually it could help us solve quite a lot of issues. Jonathan, where on that spectrum do you sit? And do you think it runs the risk of undermining our democracy and way of life, or could it be of assistance?
Well, Helen, I think this is one of the biggest challenges of our time. And in terms of that spectrum, I find myself running up and down the line, depending on who I've listened to most recently. But, you know, if you listen to some of the really heavyweight thinkers in this space, like Geoffrey Hinton or Sir Demis Habbabis or, well, Sam Altman or even Mark Zuckerberg, I can't help but be somewhat frightened by what might lie ahead, particularly if we were to develop artificial general intelligence or super intelligent beings kind of thing, and the potential implications that would have for humanity. We may not, of course, but in the meantime, just coming to your question, I'm deeply concerned that artificial intelligence is already having a damaging impact on the quality of democratic governance and discourse around the world. And it's doing that through magnifying the vast amounts of misinformation and disinformation that it's already in the arena, and through all manner of mechanisms, algorithms and echo chambers and so on. It's exacerbating the degree of political polarization that already exists, and thus making it all the more difficult to reach a consensus on the big issues that we need to try and address, like climate change or productivity issues or whatever, and increasing the risks that we will face ever declining trust in democratic institutions, which will ultimately potentially undermine the future of democracy. So on your question, where am I on the spectrum? I'm probably
up and down.
I'm at the nervous end, Helen, and how on earth we address some of those risks, I'm not really sure, but we need to try.
Lucy, bringing you in, what role is AI going to play in innovation in our economy? And I'll flick to Stephen after you, because, you know, can we, you know, accelerate productivity and value in our primary sector with AI as well? But Lucy, what role's it got in building our higher value knowledge economy?
I think it's a really good question, Helen, because as I listened to Jonathan, I felt exactly the same things that he was thinking. But at the same time, a phrase from the government's climate change strategy comes to mind, that it's a threat and an opportunity. And I think we have to see AI in that context. And I think the elders have rightly defined AI as unregulated AI, I should say, as an existential threat to humanity. But this is enormous opportunity. And there's a good context to see that is in health. I was lucky to travel to the UN General Assembly a couple of years ago with the Director General of Health, and I saw you there, Helen, speaking with the elders and doing other important things. But the penny dropped there, listening to what was happening in other systems. How AI, what the International Telecommunications Union is now theming AI for good. What was happening when the health sector in terms of AI for good? And there is a lot of opportunity for innovation. I think the key thing is it's always going to be a struggle for a small economy like New Zealand to have enough brains working on the policy and the regulation and the innovation side to take advantage of all the opportunities, and to suitably control and moderate the opportunities to make sure they really deliver for New Zealand. So I guess my main thought is opportunity, but a threat as well, needs to be well managed.
Yeah. Stephen, from that sort of agri-tech side?
Well, I guess I think Lucy's commentary about opportunity and risk applied to the agri-food sector and to the other sectors, really. But clearly there is a lot of benefit to be gained from the application of these technologies in creating competitiveness and productivity, the things we've been talking about as some of the core problems facing New Zealand. I sympathize with Jonathan, because I find myself a bit like this, although I don't know that I've gone into the detail, I'm sure, as much as you have, Jonathan. But one thing that does give me a little bit more hope, and maybe this is a faint hope, is that we're talking a lot about this. There's a lot of discussion, some here in New Zealand, and certainly around the world. And I've been part of numerous conversations and discussions and projects in relation to this within the APEC grouping, where our trading partners are grappling with all of this. We're talking about this in a way we never talked about the rise of the internet. We never talked about a whole lot of other technologies that we've come across. So that gives me cause to hope. But I do think there are risks and opportunities. Bear in mind, one of the big other things that we are facing, globally, is in relation to sustainability and the ability to get on top of climate change. And here, AI and other technologies could assist with that and be part of that solution if regulated and used in a responsible sort of way. And I think that for our agri-food exports in particular is primary, because if we can, certainly here in New Zealand, if we can get on top of the sustainability question, if we can walk the talk and avoid the greenwashing, we have a whole new basis for competitiveness for our industries, which is why the whole discussion around, leaving the Paris Agreement to me just seems so crazy. Quite apart from anything, why would we want to send a message like that to global consumers and customers who increasingly are concerned about the origin of their food? But I think we do need, and I think you just said this, Lucy, we do need our best minds on this. The government's published an AI strategy, which seems to have been developed with AI. Well, at least you can see the traces of it. But obviously we need a lot more corridor around this topic.
Yeah, I should say that one of the leaders in AI development is a Kiwi. He's from Rotorua, went to Linmore Primary, Shane Legg. He was one of 3 in London who developed DeepMind, which was at the cutting edge. And in the end, it was hard to survive on their own because the mega companies come in and offer your staff, tens of millions of dollars in packages to poach them. And he now leads DeepMind as a unit within Google. So when you do a Google search and AI comes up, there's a Kiwi behind this, right? So, very interesting, the talent in our own ranks. And having spoken to Shane, he's very exercised about, the governance issues and how to ensure it's a force for good. So more conversations to be had there. Let's come into the audience. We've got Paula Southgate, Mayor of Hamilton, on the line. And Paula observes that local government New Zealand members, that's our local authorities, supported a remit for 4-year terms 100%. They say both the major parties agree there's value in this, but won't change the system without a referendum. Given this, Paula says, I'm interested in how we get better local governance in the short term. And Paula comes in a bit later and says, how can we drive higher levels of political governance? I'm going to come to you, Jonathan, because this is really your bread and butter set of issues.
Well, look, a few quick observations. Helen, as you know, and certainly the Mayor of Hamilton knows, we're a very highly centralised polity. By comparison with most other democracies, the central government has a greater share of total government revenue, probably 90%, and has greater control over more areas of public policy and public life than is the case for comparable central governments in most other places, which means that subnational government, both regional and territorial authorities, have modest roles by international standards. They're poorly funded, and they're lumbered with some very, very significant challenges right now in terms of infrastructure, in terms of trying to adapt to the growing impacts of climate change and many other things. I think we need, as many people have suggested over a long period of time, some quite serious discussions about local government reform, about different ways of funding local government, and I think to some extent some devolution of responsibilities to local government. I appreciate that's going to be controversial, but unfortunately, certainly the current government and other governments in the past, not all of them, but have tended to want to centralize even more, to take even more control over what local governments do. And I think that's a very unfortunate sort of trend and development. But to make progress in this area, we really need a proper kind of national conversation based on good evidence, good analysis of the options, and determination to find a way forward that is going to be broadly agreed across the political spectrum. But at the moment, I'm quite fearful of where local government is heading. I was on the bus yesterday, sitting near to a local government councillor, I won't say who hasn't yet decided whether or not to stand again for the Wellington City Council. And one of the considerations is simply that the challenges are so big and the problems, so demanding, and the rewards of being a councillor so low. Why would you want to stay? And moreover, with the impacts of climate change gathering momentum, the challenges for local government councillors, politically, are going to be immense. All the more so if we fail to provide them with the tools and funding that they need to do their job well.
Yeah, I'm very concerned at what's happening. And when I was PM, I had first wonderful Minister of Local Government was Sandra Lee. And Sandra led on the 2002 Local Government Act. And it was based on concepts that came out of the Rio Earth Summit on the 4 well-beings, and really giving local government its head to pursue the 4 well-beings, social, economic, cultural, environmental, in line with long-term planning and consultation with their communities. And it was really a golden age for local government. But I've seen since, attempts to bring them back to so-called core functions. If our councils are only to do roads, drains and bridges, who's going to be working with our communities? What about our libraries? What about our cultural and sporting facilities? I mean, there's far more to local government than important as they are, local roads, bridges and drains. So, really something to be watched. And thanks to Paula for flagging these issues. The question here from Orna McGinn, who comes back to this issue of the long-term planning around complex issues like infrastructure and health. When there's such a short-term spin cycle of political leadership, is there an appetite for some of these wicked problems to sit separately to the political cycle structure? Lucy, what do you think as a long-time public servant?
I absolutely agree. We need longer term perspectives. And actually, Ashley Bloomfield wrote quite an interesting piece earlier in the year on health policy and planning. And he said we need 10-year plans, and not sort of referencing 5 and 10-year plans overseas and centrally planned economies, but just saying we need to not have policy and planning disrupted constantly by the 3-yearly pendulum swing. And one of the things that really concerns me at the moment, I think, who was it, Helen, you reposted it online, it was Andrea Vance, or there was a really good item in the media recently looking at what was called the wrecking ball culture of change that new governments impose now. When they come in, they throw everything out. And she wasn't saying it was a right or a left problem. She was saying both sides are inclined to do the same thing. And as a public servant, I see, and we all see when we're working in the system, the cost of abandoned policies. Sure, you have to abandon poor programs that aren't performing. I absolutely agree with the need for efficiency, but we do need some discipline around how governments bring in policy change and the cost of it to the public purse and to society. And it's interesting, Helen, at the World Health Organization, before I left global health diplomacy, and led by the Australians, there was a small cluster of countries who were saying to all governments, all the member states at the WHO, let's be responsible about what we ask of the WHO. Let's cost the policies that we impose upon the WHO workforce at World Health Assemblies. And by the same token, I think when governments now impose change in policy and major change in certain sectors, they should actually have a responsibility to cost it. They should tell the public, what sort of time frame are we looking at for this flip-flop change we're making? Because sometimes the argumentation will be strong enough for the public to support it. But I think often we're in the dark just how much of a cost there is to flip-flopping, policy change, whether it's in the wellbeing sector, the health sector, or otherwise. So I'm really concerned about the short-termism too.
Yeah, look, it's a chronic issue, and one of the reasons for setting up the Helen Clark Foundation in the first place was to see whether we could work on what would be good policy that any sensible government would have a good look at and consider implementing, because there's too much now of the, well, you did it, so I don't like it, so I'm repealing it. I mean, the current government spent its first 100 days repealing what the previous one had done. And the previous one was a bit inclined to chuck as well. Now, if I think back to my time, the pendulum used to swing on policy between, particularly on labour relations, and that's to be expected because the very different origins of the two major tendencies in New Zealand politics. But I can't remember ever trashing an infrastructure proposal that someone has started. And one of the very important reports the Foundation's issued in the last year or so is on infrastructure and the cost of the flip-flopping. We see the public purse funding zillions in investigations for decisions to go down a certain track, but then, next crowd didn't like it, so that's biffed, we start again. The result is nothing gets built. So we end up worse off. So, through the platform of the Foundation, we endeavour to, put out there for public discussion recommendations on policy that should be able to endure across, the swings between types. Now, Stephen, Darlene Tana has a question in the box. Kia ora, thank you for today. Brilliant discussion. My question is, are we witnessing a retreat from relational thinking? And is that just part of a political pendulum swing or something deeper? The policy shift right now feels overly transactional, quick wins, KPIs, but so many of the changes required are not quick fixes. What would you like to say about the quick fix culture, Stephen?
Well, yes, I mean, and it's an extension of this short-termism problem that we have just been talking about, isn't it? Because we live in a complex world with, multidimensional challenges, and they're not served by a quick fix. And it links back also to this question we were having about our democratic institutions, because here's a potentially sacrilegious thought. I mean, some things are best not done by governments, and infrastructure being one. This should be part of an infrastructure commission. We do have an infrastructure commission that sets long-term goals. Of course, government's going to have to fund things, and there has to be, democratic accountability at some stage. But similarly for climate change, we have a really well run and operating climate change commission that can look at the long-term perspective. So I think this is all part of the same question that we are looking at and wanting better outcomes. But sometimes we can't rely on a government that's elected for we're at 3 or 4 years where there are no checks on what they do and what they don't do. I think that probably this is one of the big reasons why we have this problem with productivity and competitiveness. Go to France, where people don't work any harder than they work in New Zealand, but look at their productivity. It's really, really high. Part of the reason is they have this amazing infrastructure right throughout their country that enables them to get goods moving along in all places. In New Zealand, we are working too hard, too long, and getting paid less and less for it. So somehow we've got to rewrite that, and we've got to get these policy areas adjusted.
Thanks, Stephen. To wind up, I'm going to draw on one question and one comment in the box. Sandra Farmer says, do we have adequate ways of drawing on the wonderful thinking of these many older folk? Yes, that's what we're providing a platform for, Sandra. So thank you.
Not you, Lucy.
Thank you for mentioning it. Much appreciated. And then Catherine Perry says, excellent conversation, but can we please have a cheerful takeaway? So my challenge to each of you, Stephen, Lucy, Jonathan, in that order, is a cheerful takeaway from today.
Oh, well, look, very quickly, Helen, I have the privilege of teaching some wonderful young people and here at Victoria University, Wellington, and I take comfort from the fact that some of these people are deeply committed to building a better, more inclusive, more sustainable Aotearoa in New Zealand, and they have the wherewithal to make a big contribution. So let's hope we can keep them here so that they can make that contribution.
Right, cheerful takeaway. Young people are our future. Invest in them, and let's make New Zealand a place they want to stay in. Lucy?
I just think we've got all the ingredients we need here at home to prosper. And I think we've got the innovators, we've got the business heft, we've got the public service, we've got a relatively effective system of government. And geographically, we're hugely privileged where we are in context of war and conflict at the moment. So I think New Zealand has all the ingredients to really shine in the next century. We just need smart minds and to keep our smart minds here working on those problems.
Amazing. Stephen?
Yes, well, kia ora to that. And I think the answer to that question is that we're here, Helen, all of us and others with whom we are connected, and we form a powerful community of ideas that we need to galvanize a lot more. We need to put aside our political differences that might arise. We have to be focused on that bigger picture. But I sense a willingness of to do this in our country and indeed around the world. I mean, there's so much we can learn from engagement with our partners around the world. We're in a very good place to be doing that. So yeah, we're here, we're ready, we're up for it.
Right, upbeat and cheerful note, and thank you so much to our wonderful panel and fellows. It's been a terrific conversation, and you would find it heartwarming to see the amazing comments in the box. And of course,
Yes.
so many questions came in, and I hope we can capture them and have them available too. I'm going to throw back to Murray to close the session.
Thank you, Helen. That's it for today's webinar. Thanks very much to our panelists, Lucy, Stephen, and Jonathan, for joining us as Honorary Senior Fellows and for sharing insights during today's incisive, compelling, and ultimately hopeful webinar about how we can ensure this country we all love deeply remains a great place to live and a great place to work in the years ahead. Thank you to our viewers today for tuning in. If you're not a member of our foundation, please consider becoming one at Helen Clark, @foundation. We'd love to have your support as we grapple with the key challenges confronting New Zealand in the 2020s and beyond. So thank you all very much for watching today's webinar, and farewell for now.